You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, David, how you doing?
I'm okay. I'm doing
You look great. It's been a while, hasn't it? You know, I read your newsletters all the time, and I think to myself, you have become the expert in this area of building teams and building culture within organizations, and you've been doing it for a while, and I've known you for now probably going on 3 decades, right? Maybe longer, right?
Amazing, right? Amazing.
We've all aged well, I hope.
Here we go. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Well, we met at Renaissance Software, and of course, Patrick Markadarian is still a good friend, and as is his whole family, including his son, who's an entrepreneur as well. I'm sure. He runs a platform that he's created where he's moved out of. Well, he's sort of still in software, but he's more like a personal training platform. He's like a total health guru.
Oh, I did. Wow. Interesting. I didn't know that. I haven't seen Patrick in years. Not in years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me more about your journey and how you got to where you are today, because you built an organization that basically does very high-end organizational consulting, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's correct. The journey is long and circuitous, never linear, never straight. First off, I'm a jazz musician. I started my career in aviation. I was a commercial pilot. Got out of that during the. I'm also old, so that's part of it. I got out of that during the 80s fuel crisis and no work, and started my career in HR and organizational change and organizational development, working on Wall Street, which is how I met Keesip and Patrick and started working at Renaissance, and have been in the corporate world. Basically the theme in my career that unifies is doing change, helping organizations change, mostly from the inside, although in the last 10 years it's been in the consulting gig, but helping transformation. And I've never seen it go well, rarely see it go well. And that's what led me to also later in life to get a PhD as a cognitive anthropologist studying culture.
Cognitive anthropology.
That's the study, that's the subfield of anthropology that studies the relationship between the brain and culture. Mm-hmm. And emerging neuroscience and cultural neuroscience, which has really established a lot of knowledge about what culture is not, and how it works, and how we relate to and interact with culture in the brain. And right. It's changing the field of culture amazingly and indelibly. And part of my, as you know from the newsletter, part of what I spend my time doing is trying to bring some of that science to the business world, because frankly, most of what the business world understands about culture is about 50 to 75 years behind the times.
Like Freudian psychology, or even before that.
Like Margaret Mead, thinking about cultures as primitive tribal societies, thinking of cultures as bounded, thinking of one company, one culture, thinking the leader sets the culture. All that stuff is just old science that's been debunked.
So when you go into a transformational project, like at a big company, I imagine you have to do a lot of research about how did they get to where they're at, and then how are they going to get through major initiatives, which I imagine AI is creating a huge number of major initiatives within companies as layoffs happen left, right, and sideways, right?
Yeah. And luckily, some of what the cognitive science is also giving us, and cognitive anthropology has got tools and methods for sort of uncovering some of that, doing some of that research and uncovering some of that, some of those hidden logics. I call them dominant logics that keep companies from changing. The things that pose biggest barriers to change, as you know, Jack, is generally culture. Why
Right.
why do industrial companies have a hard time becoming digital companies? Well, because they've been making widgets and pumps and products for 150 years, and the logic that goes into doing that successfully is completely an anathema to doing software. I mean, it sounds obvious, but that at a very high level, those kinds of experiences indelibly shape brain chemistry. They shape how you think. They shape how you see the world. They shape how you interpret risk. They shape how you think about people. They shape how you do strategy. They shape every facet of a business practice gets shaped by the stuff that you do all day long. This is what the brain science shows, the cultural neuroscience shows.
So a good example I think of is IBM back in the Selectric typewriter day. And this is back when I was in school, when I was in college.
Yeah.
And studying computer science on an IBM mainframe, but they still sort of took the view that the main business was shipping those big typewriters that had magnetic cards.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was always going to be. And when the personal computer came out, it was a little bit like, well, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak don't know what they're doing.
Right.
That's never going to work. And of
Right.
course, they ended up having to do a skunk works in Florida to create what became the personal computer, or the IBM PC.
Yeah.
And that was a skunkworks initiative. It wasn't Armonk, New York that did that. Armonk was locked into those electric typewriters and mainframe computers.
And you remember those first PCs that were sold to executives? What do they mostly do? Those PCs sat in the corner like a piece of
Right.
furniture. Like, what's that? Oh, I don't know. So my IT department gave me that thing. I don't know what the hell it does, right?
There are still lawyers 50 years later, maybe going on 60 years later, who literally will not touch a keyboard. And they'll say that's for a secretary to do. Now, those lawyers are in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and they're holding on, but they think they should have a secretary. And of course, more and more, that kind of staff, particularly as AI allows you to dictate and see words right on a screen, it's completely evaporating. That available staff is evaporating. I don't even think they call them secretaries anymore. They call them, quote, personal assistants, right?
Yeah, yeah. Which now that's part of what AI does. Yeah, yeah. So I mostly help companies, older companies, deal with transformation of this kind that you're talking about, and come up against what in the social science world we call cultural models, but I call them dominant logics because they're logics, sort of a set of logic through which you see the world that keeps you mired to the status quo. And it's what you're talking about, lawyers.
Right. So it's like the 9 to 5 job that everyone used to have, where you showed up, you punched in, or you were clocked in, or you were at least evaluated as coming in appropriately dressed up, and you go to a desk or a cubicle. That whole model, I mean, COVID completely interrupted that model.
Yeah.
Maybe for the better. Maybe it just wouldn't have happened fast enough without COVID. I imagine you're seeing that transformation where people are doing hybrid work and maybe no offices at all, totally virtual work, right?
Well, yes and no. I'd like to see more of that, but I actually believe a lot of, again, my brick and mortar clients are wanting to go back in the opposite direction and bring more people back to the office. There's certain I can see the logic in that. There's value in collaborating, and some of that collaboration and creative work that happens when teams get together can only really happen in person. I do a lot of leadership development work in service of all this transformation work, and you can do some of it online, but it's much more powerful in a room.
So you're flying around all over the country then to do these projects, I imagine, right?
Globally, yeah, the country and also internationally, a lot in Europe.
Because you're located in New York, aren't you?
I'm right here. I'm in the Bay Area.
Oh, you're in the Bay Area. Well, am I remembering you at some point? Your office was in New York, or am I misremembering that?
Back in the Renaissance days, I was in New York.
Oh, okay, many decades ago. Okay, so you do projects internationally as well as throughout the United States.
Correct.
And what's the typical scope? Is it like 6 months or 6 weeks or 6 days, or what's the typical scope of what you're doing for a client?
It depends. It's usually quite iterative. It might start small and gets to something bigger. But again, because I work in the change business, right? The transformation business. Typically, we're coming in and looking at something that's not working, like the company's been trying to change and it's going very slowly, or they're spending lots of money and not much in the way of results. And it's again cultural. The problems are cultural. So usually there's a diagnostic phase that leads then to some insights, and then we talk about what can we do to intervene, and that leads to a series of actions and outcomes. And so it's a kind of an iterative, progressive kind of thing. But yeah, it can typically lead from a month to a year.
Is it becoming more and more common for corporations to actually have people like you on staff internally in the company, where essentially there are troubleshooters that are trying to get change management to happen without an outside consultant? Does that happen at all, or is it mostly outside consultants that do this now?
I think it's really more the latter. It's difficult. It depends, but it's difficult. When you're on the inside, so to speak, it's difficult sometimes to see the system.
Mm-hmm.
Like when the fish is in the tank, it's hard to see the water, right?
Right.
Outsiders have a great benefit of coming in and seeing the system. Now, the best change leaders, however, having said all that, the best leaders that I know and that I work with are somehow able to straddle the inside and the outside world. They keep enough distance from their system, their human system, to see what's going on. They can spot patterns. A lot of what I do, the reason I do so much leadership development is I'm not of the mind, like some of my competitors who believe that you have to bring in an army of 100 consultants and do all the work for you. I'm of the mind of creating leaders who are change masters, really masterful leaders who have enough self-awareness and skill and competence and courage to do the work themselves internally. So a lot of the leadership work I do is helping leaders become change leaders, great change leaders, so they can do that for themselves. And a lot of what the work is about is spotting patterns in your organization, seeing the patterns kind of at a deeper level, and then challenging those patterns effectively, not destructively, because you can alienate people that way, as you know, but
right.
Challenging, but a lot of that comes down to challenging orthodox ways of doing things, challenging status quo, challenging power. And of course, there's skill in that. And so a lot of my work is about creating those skills to do that. So they can.
I'll tell you the conflict I see all the time, and it makes me think of you and the kinds of work you do, but you can tell me I'm way off base. I see a lot of companies that have essentially an R&D software development team that is trying to work with a marketing and revenue team. Yeah. And the two are not really mediated very well by the CEO or the COO or someone at the top that's supposed to really be probably more of a mediator. Yeah. And they're fighting. And the fight is usually, hey, we invented it, it sells itself. Why are you guys taking so much of the credit? Why do you get so much commissions? We're jealous. More of the budget should come to us. That's the R&D side. Yeah. And then the marketing side is like, you're not building the right thing, or you're not listening to what we're saying. The customer wants this, the customer wants that. What you built is nice for in the lab, but it's not usable. It's not acceptable. We can't sell it. And it's like they clash head to head. And there have been major fights. Many years ago, I represented what was then called personal software. VisiCalc, the original spreadsheet, was a fight between what became VisiCorp, which could have become Microsoft had this fight not happened, in my opinion. But there was a fight with software arts, the development people. The software arts people were in Boston and MIT people, hardcore engineers, software people. And the personal software, and then it became VisiCorp people, were Northern California, Silicon Valley. They knew how to do marketing. They knew how to do distribution. And man, did they buck heads. And it eventually got to court. Yeah. At first in California, then in Boston. I mean, I can go on and on about what happened. But, the company got destroyed as a result of that litigation. And Lotus 123 came in and ate their lunch. And then, of course, Microsoft came in with Excel and kind of eight Lotus 1-2-3s lines, and the evolution of a spreadsheet played out in the way it played out. We were all users of VisiCalc back in the day, but then once Lotus 1-2-3 came, everyone went to that. And now, of course, everyone's on Excel.
I didn't know that about your background, Jack. And of course, I started my career at Lotus. So I was at Lotus in the 90s in the 1-2-3 heyday, and part of my first experience doing this kind of change work stuff was around Lotus Notes.
That's interesting. I didn't know that because Mitch Kapoor, of course, was the person who had worked at VisiCorp and then got funding to basically say, I can do a better spreadsheet. I mean, became a competitor to Dan Foster. Dan is still around. Dan was the founder of Personal Software. He still runs a little software company, far lower scale, far smaller scale. But you were there at Lotus Notes, and people really believe Lotus Notes could have been Facebook. Lotus Notes could have been Facebook.
I was an acolyte. I was a believer, man. It was a fantastic product, way ahead of its time. For me, it was all about allowing, numpties like me to program visually without code.
Right. No code, low code.
I created all sorts of Lotus Notes apps. I even started my first startup. My first foray as an entrepreneur was creating a Lotus Notes-based platform for doing HR talent management stuff.
And I tell you, I know lawyers in law firms that still use Lotus Notes because there is an online version that's still available. It's not from IBM because IBM ended up acquiring Lotus.
I went through that process too. Yeah, I went through the IBM acquisition. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a great story because I think Mitch did okay. He's now in charge of the foundation. He does a lot of philanthropy. Yeah. But in general, these stories of what could have been, woulda, coulda, shoulda, they're all about change management. They're all about what you do, right?
Yeah. Hindsight being what it is. But yeah, I spend a lot of my work is actually just as you described, engineering teams with sales teams, or often customer support teams with engineering teams, and a lot of it is just about exposing assumptions,
right,
on both sides, and getting to the core of what that is. It sounds kind of simple when you and I talk about it, but in the moment, in the heat of battle, as you know, it's really hard.
Well, you're like a quasi mediator. I mean, you're effectively like, I think of a CEO in the highest level as someone that has super mediation skills.
Yep.
And is a great listener, male, female, whatever, great listener, and spends way more time listening than talking, way more time, and can become like the human processor of everything going on in a family or in a group or in a team or an organization, which might be 200 people or it might be 20,000 people.
Yeah.
And they just have their hands on what the real pulse is. And they're not showmen. So, I'll just drop a footnote that I could be totally wrong about it, which is I look at NVIDIA as such an amazing success story. And then I look at that CEO and I look at Musk as such an amazing success story. And I look at him as a CEO and I think to myself, there must be someone else that's doing the mediation, because I can't imagine either of those CEOs really being in the trenches, right?
Well, I mean, look at Microsoft. I was at Microsoft for 10 years. And I was there during the bomber era.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about showman, right?
Right.
Comes down from a ceiling on a wire, and then look at Satya.
Right. Very humble.
They couldn't be more different. Satya,
right.
And I knew Satya back in the day, and he's a great listener. He's just as you described. He would ask more questions in a meeting than make statements.
Right. I mean, Bomber, it's a showman when he goes out and buys a basketball team. But I'll tell you the interesting Bomber fact, which is he makes or will soon make something like, I didn't believe this number initially, but it's going to be something like $1 billion a year of dividend, $1 billion a year in dividends, or maybe it's even a month, but it was a huge number, like from the Microsoft stock that he owns. It's either per month or per year, and either way, it's such a big number. I mean, I don't even know how you can give it away fast enough. I really don't.
Most valuable company on the planet right now, right?
Right. I mean, it always buys between Microsoft and Apple.
Yeah.
And I just think, if we're sort of looking at those success stories, because my first law firm, Davis Stafford Tillman and Fenwick, we started Apple Computer. Jobs and Wozniak came in dead broke. We did the paperwork to get them started.
You were involved in the fight with Windows.
Yeah. I mean, all that user interface. I became the expert on user interface intellectual property. I wrote articles about it. It's just a great story, and really a great series of things that happened that have led us to where we are today. But if you look at Apple, I went to the Apple store recently because I just had to see whether this VR stuff, this AR stuff, this Vision Pro stuff was really something that was going to be game changing for Apple. And I concluded, and I bought one. I spent the $4,000. I bought one, but I'll tell you, I don't think Steve Jobs would have shipped that product. I think Steve Jobs would have said it's not ready. I think he would have said there's too many moving parts. Like, for example, you have to have the right spacing. There's like a spacer that goes in. Everyone's eyes are a little bit different. So they haven't come out with a generalized way to space it. So they have to measure you. And then they measure you because they do like a personalized thing. And they're like, oh, we don't have the spacer in stock. But we can give you this other spacer for a while, but there's going to be leakage of light. So it's not going to be as dark as it should be because you enter this chamber. And you know what? I think Jobs would have said, forget it. We got to go back to the drawing board. I'm not going to do a product where it doesn't come across right off the get-go as perfect. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting question whether effectively quality gets impacted by the desire to sort of ship a product that's not ready. And Jobs was pretty good at sort of stopping people from shipping a product if the quality wasn't up to his standards. In that respect, I think he was really an important leader for that company.
And Apple quality has slipped over the years, as we know, right? And I'm a Mac user. I mean, I left the Windows world as soon as I left Microsoft. But
I mean, you look around and it looks like they so dominate the smartphone market. I know that Samsung ships more volume, but in the knowledge worker era, everyone seems to have an iPhone or even two. Or I saw people with 3 and 4 of them, and they're like managing them between their multiple hands. Two on one hand, 2 on another.
Yeah.
So when you try to understand what's going on inside of a company, do you go in with some sort of questionnaire or something just to kind of get the data, or you just do a lot of your own research about the company going in?
We use methodology from cognitive anthropology. It's well established set. Yeah, it's questionnaires, but it's a set of a lot of open-ended questions. But then where the magic is in the analysis of the questions, because what we're often doing in a culture engagement is we are trying to get down to the dominant logic behind the prevailing knowledge about what it takes to succeed, or what the nature of the problem is, or what the challenges are, right? I mean, there's some sort of high gain questions that you can ask, and you know this as an attorney, of course, that will trigger all sorts of assumptions or beliefs about how things are or how things should be. The anthropologists know that that's what we call a schema or a cultural model, a kind of a heuristic, but it's a mindset. It's a mindset, right? But it's not conscious. Usually it's tacit. And that's what we're after. We're after the implicit or tacit assumptions by which you run your business and think the world and think how the world operates. And it's not about right or wrong. It's that looking at those tacit assumptions or beliefs or idealizations, those are the things that tend to keep you sort of thinking that the world as you see it today is going to be the same as the world as it is tomorrow. And that's where companies get in trouble.
So let's use a good example, because Warren Buffett has gone public with the view that AI is really more dangerous. Yes. And like the danger is greater than the benefit. And it seems to me that he must be pushing back hard on Berkshire Hathaway bringing any AI into the organization to make what really are business judgments, business decisions. And we also know that lots of companies want to believe that AI can kind of provide a set of insights within a human being. And this is the same issue for law firms, by the way. There are law firms that are absolutely against no AI. We're not doing it. We're doing it the old way. Of course, the old way includes computers that fundamentally are doing a lot of searching and screening, quasi-AI. But fundamentally, there's a law firm camp that says it's got to be human, it's got to be a person, it's got to be a person with certain qualifications. And then there's a group of younger lawyers. Hey, I don't need all that overhead. I don't need all those people. I don't need the hassle. I'll rely on AI, and then I'll work from there. So I'm kind of curious about, what would you say to someone like Berkshire Hathaway? That would be a big engagement if you had a group of younger professionals at that company saying, Warren's kind of slowing us down, and we got to stay with the pack, or at least try to leap ahead if we can. That would be a big project, I would imagine, because you got a guy who's the genius of Omaha, right? At the top.
First, anything out of Warren's mouth, I would say there's probably some strategic intent behind it.
Right.
Like he might believe in AI, but is trying to influence governments to act responsibly, for example. Or, there's always when Bill or Warren or any of these, leaders speak, there's always some sort of political or a strategic agenda behind it. So I would look at that first.
Right.
And of course, as you well know, the truth is somewhere in between, right? Because,
right.
Any technology can be evil, as you know.
Right.
And there's a huge benefit, a huge upside of AI, right? So we always try to look at what's on a much more prosaic level, much more sort of less societal and more sort of business level. What's the organization trying to do? What are you trying to be when you grow up as a business, as a company? Where are you going? What do you want? And then what's keeping you? And those are the fundamental questions we start with.
So you must
become just an enabler or a disabler, but it's just part of the mix of the tool set. Yep, sorry.
So you must see all the time situations where there are people that kind of like the status quo because it makes a lot of money. I think of Facebook as an advertising company. Really, people think of it as a community, but really an advertising company. And then there's this whole multi-billion-dollar initiative to create essentially a metaverse, which will be a virtual community, where you'll wear some sort of headset. We don't know exactly what that'll look like, because it seems like everything that's come out to date has drawbacks and isn't quite as lightweight and isn't quite fashionable. It looks like turns you into a cyborg. And it seems like that would be a major fight between people that are saying, why are we not sticking to the knitting where we make money? And you got a founder who says, I'm going to spend the money. I've got the control to do it. No one's going to stop me. No board of directors is going to get in my way, and I'm going to do it. And then the stock goes down by 25% when he announces in a quarterly meeting or quarterly call that, hey, I'm going to load up at this point and go forward with the metaverse AI version of the future, which might or might not happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, the question is, again, at Microsoft, I think we always did this pretty well, albeit with a lot of anxiety and tension and fights along the way. But I mean, how well are you firewalled from your main business, right?
Right.
And yet the firewall can't be too rigid, because you need some of that knowledge in the core business to translate into the new business, and vice versa, right? It can't be, but there's that. And for me, managing those divisions between the new and the old. I mean, in Microsoft, I went through the fight that I'm sure you know about between, the prevailing conversation in the 2000s at Microsoft was, how could we possibly give away Office?
Right.
It's a multi-billion-dollar franchise, and you want to give it away for free? And now look at Office 365, the low version.
Turned out to be a great decision.
It's free.
It turned out to be a great decision, though. Right?
That was a 10-year fight. A 10-year fight between a lot of the Office executives saying no effing way.
Right.
And the rest of the company saying, this is the internet, this is where it's going.
Right.
And so the question that's that. So how do you manage that boundary? And this is where the leadership lessons come into. How do you deal with that boundary? Because there's no, in retrospect, it seems that there's a right answer, but there really isn't a right answer. They're just choices.
They're choices, and
Yeah.
you get to a fork in the road, and we're kind of there now on AI in many ways, because people at the fork of the road are like, I don't know if we can do this. I don't think people are going to like it. But, we made those choices when personal computers started to replace typewriters. It was the same issue.
That's right.
Can you adapt to it?
Yeah.
And people that adapt quickly succeed.
Yeah.
And people that don't usually get pushed around or pushed out or demoted, right? I mean, that's what typically happens.
Yeah.
Tell people how they can reach you, because you are the expert in this area, and we have people that listen to the podcast and say, hey, I didn't even know this whole field existed. I didn't realize that it existed. So how would they reach you?
I hope that that people find our conversation useful. I have certainly enjoyed it. Culture-logics.com. Culture like the culture, logics like logic with a plural, culture-logics.com.
And they can also reach you by phone, because you do answer the phone occasionally, right? Or is that old school?
I don't have a phone. I only have a cell phone, but yes, indeed.
All right, fair enough. Thanks, David. We'll do it again as I see news items that are relevant. Hopefully we can have you back as one of these issues comes up, because I think the whole Warren Buffett thing is a whole separate topic of the older people that are staying in work really long and affecting everyone else in a big way. So thanks for your time. We'll talk again. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.